Hi, everybody. Welcome to another podcast. And I'm honoured to have three other great authors with me. For those of you who don't know me, because I'm sure some people will see this without knowing me, I'm a holistic vet and human practitioner. And I've been advocating raw feeding for cats and dogs who are carnivores. And I've been doing that for over 25 years. And since I've been carnivore myself, it's made me so much more aware of how damaging the plant aspect of the diet can be. And so I've don't know if I can read the book here. There we go. Why vegans have smaller brains. So that's the book, and I've read it, and it's brilliant, and I recommend everybody gets it and reads it. But I've got Anita and Ali and Dave here who are going to talk a little bit about sort of carnivore and how important animals are from a dietary point of view, and how harmful the plants are, when we have them as well. So that's enough about me. But if I don't know if Ali, if you want to start off, do a brief introduction, then we'll sort of widen it and start talking.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so I'm Ali Morgan. So I'm an agricultural specialist. Originally began as in applied farm research in the UK, and then into frontline advisory work with farmers in many different parts of England. A long time in the east of England, where most of our arable farming is, which convinced me of the harms of arable farming and the benefits of ruminant livestock, grazing livestock. As time went on, I've moved more into environmental work and the impacts of various different farm systems on the environment, and also some policy and strategy work. I met Anita about probably about 4 years ago, and heard that she was writing a book about nutrition. And by that time, I was already I'd already begun following a ketogenic diet, but I believed the story that that we are omnivores, and didn't realize that actually we are carnivores and we're better not to eat plants. I changed to the Sapiens diet, which is the diet that we recommend in the book, and saw major health improvements. And then Anita asked me if I would write the farming and environment chapters of the book. So that's the second half of the title, is "And How Cows Reverse Climate Change," where we talk about climate change and the misinformation about that, and how grazing livestock, including ruminants, actually do not cause climate change, don't contribute to it. They help to reverse it. And also all the other environmental aspects. So in terms of biodiversity, habitat destruction, the benefits of grazing livestock, and the harms that arable farming does. So in terms of the ethics of dietary choice, that it's much better to eat a carnivore diet based or a sapiens diet based on large ruminants, so pasture reared beef and lamb, both for animal life and for environmental benefits.
Awesome. Anita, do you want to give us a brief introduction to you?
Yep. Hi, I'm Anita Tagore. I'm a retired GP. I qualified in medicine in the 1980s from the University of Cambridge. More recently, I did a master's in nutrition at Oxford Brookes University. I've spent the last 15 years reading about nutrition and diet, which is something I've always been interested in. I also bought a farm, which was a conventional dairy farm when I bought it in 2017. And in the last 5 years, we've switched to regenerative beef farming on the farm. And I've spent the last 6 years or so writing this book. And Ali and Dave came on board about 3 years ago. What I've learned over the years is that, yes, the Sapiens diet, which is mostly animal fat, meat, a little bit of offal, and optional small amounts of fruit and vegetables, is the healthiest diet for people and for the planet.
Awesome. And Dave, finally to Dave.
Yeah, I'm Dave Ellis. My career, after I left university, degree in earth sciences, I spent my career as a geophysicist looking for oil and gas. I retired, about 9 years ago now, and then through meeting Anita and then Ali, I've become, well, first of all, I've converted my diet. I used to believe what we are still being told to eat by the Eat Well guidelines and all that stuff. I've switched from that to the Sapiens diet, and I also, like Ali and Anita, feel so much better for it. But also through the farming side, really interested to learn about how farming works and how it impacts the environment, how it impacts ecosystems, and the differences between livestock farming and arable farming. And as Ali says, the messaging is completely back to front on that as well. So my interest then, was asked to contribute to the book, mainly on the diet side, helping to kind of edit and write the chapters on the diet. But really enjoy, reading and hearing what Ali has to say in the second half of the book about farming. Really interesting.
Excellent. I mean, it's fascinating, isn't it? Because it's all linked in. Our food is reliant on the farming, and if the farming gets pushed out, then we're not going to have the food, and that's the same thing for us as well as for the pets as well.
Yeah, sorry, that was a big rationale for the book, to make it not just a diet book, not just an environment book, but to emphasize the link that how we choose to eat influences farming, and how we farm influences what we eat. You can't really talk about one without the other. So we have this diagram which we put in the book that links diet with farming, with the environment, and with health. So they're all interlinked.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think see it all together as well, which is why I think the book is so excellent, how it all ties everything together. So Anita, for you first, I have a problem. The biggest as a vet, that dogs especially have been classified or been trying to be reclassified as omnivores. Of course, they're carnivores, and cats are carnivores as well. And yet there is a big push. You'll be horrified to hear within the veterinary profession to even to push vegan diets for our carnivores, which just doesn't add up, and they will still try. Even professors of nutrition will still try and make out that dogs are omnivores, which just beggars belief how they manage that with the anatomy, the dentition and everything. Even more so for dogs, because the way a dog's jaw works, it's up and down. There's no sideways movement that you get with the herbivores for grinding, because if they're crunching on a bone, it will dislocate the jaw if it was allowed to move sideways. So it's kept going up and down. So you must have a difficulty with trying to persuade your colleagues that people are primarily hypercarnivore, even though the anthropologists have come out and said that as well.
Well, that was one of the main reasons for writing the book. to try and convince people of what I think is the right diet for humans. The information is all out there. It's really easily accessible. And I don't understand why everybody doesn't come to the same conclusions that we have. If you look at us, at humans, from an evolutionary point of view, in the book, the chapter is called The Magic of Meat. And what we say is that we didn't evolve to eat meat. We evolved because we ate meat. Briefly, if you look at the timeline over the last 6 million years, when we split from the chimpanzee line, our brains have tripled in size, and then the chimpanzee brain has stayed the same size. What's led to those changes is having animal food in our diet that freed up energy. What happened, evolutionarily speaking, was that the human gut became smaller. Within the gut, the small intestine became longer and the colon became smaller, but overall it became smaller. That freed up energy for our brains to grow. And our anatomy is more similar to that of a carnivore than of a herbivore. Those are the changes that's happened over the years. And there are many other adaptations that we have, like our shoulder anatomy, our ability to sweat, which all point towards us being carnivores.
Absolutely, absolutely. Have you got any ideas? Because obviously people will say to me, well, if animals ate carnivore before, why haven't they developed the same sort of size brain that we have? You know, sort of there seems to be would be a logic that says, well, why don't we have talking dogs? And
it was one of the first pushbacks I had when I explained the book to a friend. Well, you know, we don't have the teeth. Well, you know, you haven't got the teeth and the claws to hunt. And if it was all about meat and about the fat in meat, then why aren't all animals, as you say, like dogs and cats, as intelligent? And so the story we tell in the book is that what happened with humans is that we were already becoming, or were, bipedal. We had free arms and hands with opposable thumbs and fingers that allowed us to manipulate the world. So as well as our intelligence grew, we were able to put that theory into practice and manipulate the world. So we scavenged initially. So we never hunted with our teeth and claws. We scavenged, and then as our intelligence grew and our brains grew, we developed tools, hunting tools or smashing tools with rocks to access the bone marrow, to access the brain, to cut meat and so on, and then eventually developed, you know, weapons that allowed us to hunt more effectively. So yeah.
I mean, it's
But
fascinating.
dogs and cats are intelligent, but
Yes.
not in the way in which they can manipulate the world.
Exactly.
They're very social. Well, dogs especially, very social animals, can hunt in packs. Their intelligence developed in a different way.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Go on.
Another adaptation that resulted from our change in diet was that we needed less time and force to chew food, because animal foods are easier to chew and digest. And that changed our facial anatomy, which in turn led to the development of speech, which helped.
Absolutely. I mean, it's one of those funny things that you hear, that animals actually are more intelligent humans because they didn't develop speech, because they knew it would lead to law and lawyers and rules. So it's sort of amusing side effect of not having the same language. But it's interesting, isn't it? Because obviously the difference between dogs and cats as carnivores is they do crunch the bones. And this is one of my big bugbears that I have with pre-ground raw feeding, is that the physical aspect of the diet isn't being properly addressed by by pre-grinding, and it's that crunching of the bones with the teeth that causes that abrasion on the teeth, and also the gum tooth margin that keeps that strong, and then that stops the pockets coming down by the teeth and the periodontal disease, and then the chronic inflammation and attack on the immune system that happens through that. And so the physical side of the diet and that power that they can get through the jaws is obviously the difference between them and us. But we are still nonetheless, as you say, carnivores the same as they are. And the fact that they've got this anatomy that they can still try and people can still try and make out that dogs are omnivores just beggars belief. They've got absolutely zero adaptation to being omnivorous. They've got no fermentation area of the gut, as I'm sure Ali will, knows all about the ruminant gut, and they've got teeth which wear away, and because they're continually grinding the hard cellulose, and obviously then they've got the fermentation aspects in the forestomach, and it is that fermentation of plant material that actually releases the nutrients.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you want to expand on that, Ali?
Yeah, I mean, I've owned a number of dogs over the years, and the stuff that the pet food manufacturers tried to sell you is just diabolical, and I've had dogs with problems. Adopted a red setter some years ago that was about 5 years old at the time, and had been fed on one of these very cheap meals, with stuff like flake maize in it and stuff like that. And she had lifelong digestive issues. Initially she was just sick and had diarrhea every day. And I went to the vet. He said to put her onto a particular dog food and rice. But this is some years ago, but gradually got things better by increasing the amount of just meat and animal food in the diet. But she never fully recovered. And also with pet cats, in the past, when I was a child, we had a pet cat that died very young, feeding it a kibble, and it got kidney disease. And so, you can see that there's something wrong, and you see that there's all this illness in our pet cats and dogs, the same kinds of illnesses that we're getting, because we're feeding them the same erroneous diet that we're eating. With herbivorous animals, the ruminants like cows and sheep, they have a much more complex stomach system with four stomach compartments, and the first compartment, the rumen, is basically a fermentation chamber full of liquor with all sorts of microbes in it. That might be 200 litres in a large dairy cow. And it's there that the cellulose, the plant fibre, is broken down, whereas we can't break down plant fibre at all, the cellulose. So they break it down, and because it's in the first part of the digestive tract, that helps them maximize the amount of energy and nutrients that they can obtain from the plant materials, and makes them very efficient at surviving in sparse grazing areas or in poor conditions. And we've followed these animals around the globe, out of Africa and into the northern part of the world, which enabled us to survive where there were very few plants, just like in Mongolia and those kind of areas where people could not have lived and thrived without grazing animals, methane producing animals that are supposed to give us heart disease and colon cancer and everything else.
Yeah, those modern diseases that never actually happened in those times when we were following them around and eating them. I mean, I always say to people, actually, no mammal is evolved to eat plants at all, because actually it's not the mammals, it's not the cattle or the sheep that are actually digesting the plant material themselves directly. It's microbes within their fermentation areas. Obviously, for the ruminants, it's at the front, and for the horses, it's at the back end in the hindgut. But all nutrition comes for them as a result of bacteria, a microbial fermentation. They don't actually, you could argue, they don't actually get any nutrition almost directly from the plants themselves that doesn't involve plant, that and because we haven't got that fermentation area, and because cats and dogs haven't got those fermentation areas either, that is the biggest indication as to what we shouldn't be eating. And that was, I think, one of the main, there was two things that really stuck in my head from your book, which made me sort of not change what I'm thinking, but change how I said it. And the first one was, I think Anita's already said, it's we evolved because of the food we were eating. We didn't evolve to eat that food, and that's a very subtle but really important difference. And the same is true for our cats and dogs, is they evolved eating and scavenging carcasses, and they're probably carnivores is probably probably maybe even a more accurate description, because they disrupt, they disregard the stomach contents and pull them out, and they'll eat some of the offal in the organs like the liver and whatever, but they actually discard the stomach contents. So that was really a big wake up, sort of not sort of bright light moment for me, that I wasn't quite saying it right. So that was really, really important. And then also the other thing is, it's important what we don't eat as much as what we do eat. And that again is one of the problems I have. Obviously, I see, dogs that are itchy and have got allergies, and the skin is, as far as I'm concerned, a continuation of the gut. It's the inside of the tube rather than the outside of the tube. And you can't heal the skin if you don't heal the gut first. And even though people might switch from sort of plant-based kibbles onto sort of raw, if they're including those plant ingredients within that, then you're not allowing the gut to properly heal because of the anti-nutrients that you get in the plants. And there's this tendency to focus on the antioxidants and what is perceived as the positive parts of plants, and to completely ignore the fact that there's anti-nutrients in there as well that disrupt nutrition, disrupt digestion, disrupt hormones, and all the rest of it. And so I sort of like to go into that side of it a bit, if
Yeah.
okay with that.
So one of the key benefits of the Sapiens type diet is that it reverses abnormal intestinal permeability, or leaky gut, as it might be more commonly known. So just as our skin is a barrier against the outside world, so the gut is also a barrier against the outside world. And studies have shown that when you reverse a leaky gut, so you correct the abnormal intestinal permeability in the gut, the leakiness of other barriers, such as the skin and the blood-brain barrier, or many other barriers in the body, they all become more secure. And it's plant foods that cause problems with leaky gut. And it's related to all sorts of diseases, especially autoimmune diseases. So when you take up Sapiens type diet, the integrity of the gut barrier goes back to what it should be. And that's one of the methods whereby the diet works.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? Because autoimmune diseases weren't the sort of thing that you think about. You might think of allergies, but autoimmunity was sort of a new one to me when I came across Dr. Anthony Chafee, and then read your book as well. That was really important to me. And it's difficult, isn't it? Because people, I mean, even unfortunately, there's a lot of the raw feeding vets who are still advocating putting plant material and say that it's okay to have it in the diet, and yet so they'll be including things like sweet potato, rice, broccoli, and some of the vegetable oils, and you think, well, just because they want the omega-3, and you think, well, that's we're getting too much omega-6 at the same time, and there's all these anti-nutrients, sort of disruptors, and of course oxalates as well, and then we wonder why they sort of it's like a poisoning, isn't it? But the poisoning is its dose and how long the body can accumulate, how much it accumulates, and some of these anti-nutrients don't get broken down, and so especially like the oxalates, so they accumulate and then they can deposit around the body and cause things like arthritis. And I always say to people, one of my bugbears is what's common and what's normal. They're not the same. You've got an old dog that's arthritic and people will go, well, that's normal. And I go, no, it's common, because dogs that are old and don't have arthritis aren't abnormal. They're just uncommon. And so we've got to change how we think about these things, because otherwise the implication for saying, well, it's normal, is there's an expectation that we're going to get ill when we're old. I'm a coward. I want to get old and die without pain. That's what I do. I am trying to be the best I can be now, but I don't want to have years of pain before I die. I want to enjoy myself all the way up to the end.
How long has it been since you've changed your diet?
Probably be 2 years in August. I was always fairly meat heavy before that. But I sort of dropped the plants off altogether. And then when I first did it, I included honey, because it was, I saw it as an animal product. And also because I found this really, really tasty organic honey that had been made in some rainforest in Congo or somewhere, and it tasted absolutely amazing. So I didn't have a lot, but obviously there was some sugar in there. And then I saw Anthony's video on honey, and so I stopped. And I stopped, coffee as well. I've never been a tea drinker, but I stopped drinking coffee as well, and so I just basically have water. And raw milk. I've got very lucky. I've got a raw dairy farmer who's also regenerative. He doesn't feed his cows any grains at all. And you probably find this interesting, Ali. He was a commercial dairy farmer, in the normal sense of the word, and then he decided to do raw, and then he decided to stop the grains, and the cows blanked him for about 6 months. They wouldn't come in like they normally did, because they wanted their fix of the cake in the parlor. And so he had to then go out and get them and drag them in and to milk them. And he said it took about 6 months, and they'd actually bellow at him because they weren't getting their carbohydrate fix. And because it was obviously based on grain, and because they're herbivores, you sort of think, well, you wouldn't expect them to have that sort of addictive behavior. And I see it a lot with horses as well, where they're kicking the door at the certain time, because that sort of Pavlov dog response for their sugar carbohydrate hit is they're expecting it at a certain time of the day. And yet that owners tend to think of it as slightly amusing, and they it doesn't, with the best will in the world, they're not being nasty or anything, but they just don't recognize that it's an addict behavior. And the same with people with
So
the
carbs have been
carbohydrates
shown
too.
to be addictive
Yeah.
in studies which look at how much the reward part of the brain lights up with different foods. It lights up the most with carbohydrates compared to the other macronutrients, protein or fat. So yes, there is a physical reason why carbs are addictive. I mean, besides the whole insulin thing, where
Yeah.
insulin and glucose thing, there is actually evidence of carbs being addictive when looking at your brain.
Absolutely.
When it comes to, I was just going to say, when it comes to cows or other ruminants, as you say, people might think, well, grains are okay for them. They eat grains. Well, evolutionarily, they wouldn't have. They might have, what they were eating from pasture might have included small grass seeds, but grass seeds are small, and
Yes.
the volume that they would be getting wouldn't be anything like the amount of grains that we're feeding to intensively reared dairy cows these days. They're getting large amounts of compound feed, usually a manufactured feed, which is basically grains and probably soya or other extra protein. These grains can cause a lot of problems if you introduce them too fast to a ruminant like a cow or a sheep, and go too high. They can develop acidosis and other metabolic diseases as a result, and it can kill them quite quickly. I've seen mistakes made where, for instance, on a research farm I was working at, we had lambs grazing on dairy pasture, the store lambs, and there was a tractor driver was doing the feeding, so he wasn't a properly trained livestock herdsman. Some of the lambs were sold, and he didn't realize that you had to reduce the amount of feed that you were supplement. So we were supplementing with low levels, but suddenly the lambs that were left were getting huge amount, much larger amount, and a lot of them keeled over and died. So that's the kind of thing, because it's not their natural diet. They can adjust to it, but you often still get problems with that diet. And in terms of environmentally, grains are a major part of the problem, because it's the growing of the grains that causes a lot of environmental damage.
Yeah, it's interesting because obviously I'm aware of Alan Savory's work in Africa, sort of rewilding and sort of helping to get plants growing where they haven't done before. And of course, we sort of think of farming and growing grains in sort of monocultures, and when they're doing their nomadic grazing and they move on to different areas and leave their dung and urine and everything behind that helps to provide nutrients for the soil that before they come round again the next time, then they wouldn't be coming across, as you say, all those grains in the same density that we sort of grow them, and of course that's what's damaging our soil now as well. And we want to get back to regenerative farming as much as possible, because we need that good quality food. And because it's regenerative, it's probably not quite so. I know John, when he's doing his regenerative dairy farming, he's probably averaging, I don't know, 2,000 to 3,000 litres per cow, as opposed to the commercial dairies are up to sort of heading towards 10,000 litres a cow average now, which is, even when I was doing my farm vet work, we thought 10,000 was something, a really exceptional herd.
Yes.
And most of them are perhaps 7 or 8, and I used to tell the farmers even back then, I think you should stay around 6, not feed so much concentrate and not put so much pressure on the cows, and you wouldn't get the metabolic problems and the mastitis and the lameness that comes from it as well, because the health isn't always manifested just as a digestive issue, is it? You'll get problems with digestion will sort of, it's the basis of our health overall. And people sort of tend to then not associate, serious illnesses or illnesses that are non-gut related with what's going on in the gut and the digestion. So
that's right.
sort of fascinating, isn't it, how it all ties in together.
And of course, we've also bred dairy cows in particular for higher and higher yields. The Holstein cow that
Yeah.
most intensive dairy farmers are using these days produces huge yields of milk, and these animals are, they calve down and come into milk for the first time, and suddenly the demand on their bodies is just huge, and you're getting metabolic problems straight away. And the Holstein has a lot of problems. And some years ago, I was working with Bristol University Veterinary School, and they were trying to encourage farmers to realise that going for a more moderate cow, either back to the Frisian or the Channel Island breeds, or a cross, as the New Zealanders had by then, they would reduce their lifetime veterinary costs, and cow would last longer, and actually, although it would be producing less milk overall, it's the reduction in veterinary costs and mortality, etc., would make it worthwhile and better for the farmer in the end as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they're even manipulating the animal feeds now to try and change the food for us as well. They're talking about putting puffers into cattle feed to try and reduce the amount of saturated fats in the milk, and totally the wrong way for health.
Yes.
And they're now talking even about relaxing the rendering laws for inclusion in cattle feed now as well. So they're going to be looking at allowing insect protein into cattle feed, and they're looking at now allowing pig protein, rendered protein into poultry feed, and poultry rendered into pig feed. Completely, obviously, going against those restrictions that were
Yeah.
put in place for BSE on the sole reasons they want to bring us in line with the EU. But I just wonder. I don't think any work probably has been done to say, well, what effect does having insect protein within cattle feed, what effect will that have on the protein of cows in terms of meat, or maybe in the milk as well? I mean,
Yeah.
we're
All
sort of messing with
unnatural
our food chain.
diets, I'd say, are not worth doing. History shows that it doesn't suit us or suit an animal
No.
if we switch to something that we shouldn't be eating. As you
Uh,
mentioned, the BSE crisis is a really good example.
yeah,
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
mean,
we should have learned our lessons from that. It was such a costly exercise, and the number of animals that had to be slaughtered, and the damage to the reputation of British farming was massive. We shouldn't be allowing this. And one of the
And
things,
sadly, also brain, which is one of the most nutritious foods,
yes.
nobody eats anymore because of the whole BSE crisis.
No,
yeah,
I agree. I mean, it is utter madness, isn't it? I mean, I think there's a great saying, isn't it, that humans are the only species clever enough to manufacture
Yes.
their own food, stupid enough to eat it. And
yeah,
I had another line in there. I think, and arrogant enough to think that we can outdo nature. You
yeah,
know, that's what we're messing around
Mm,
with what all the diets all these animals evolved to eat, and then and we became healthy and then we've got all these modern diseases because heart disease wasn't known in human medicine until about the 1800s, I think. So you know I'm sure there was a few before that, but certainly not in the levels we've got now, and yet we haven't seemed to learn that very basic lesson. If
yeah,
you keep doing the same thing, you're going to get another mad result. So what we need to do is go back to the ancestral diets for all of the animals, not just for us, because if we screw it up for them, then we are potentially screwing it up for
yeah,
ourselves, even if we eat the right things. If what it's eating has
yeah,
been altered from what we evolved eating, then it's going to impact our health as well, and that's You know, I
Yeah.
just, it seems
Since the
so obvious.
dietary guidelines have been introduced, the rates of diabetes and obesity have trebled. It's just that's testament to the fact that the guidelines are so wrong.
Yes. I mean, there's even
And
juvenile diabetes now, which never used to be a
Exactly.
thing, you know,
yeah,
sort of, we'll give it a name so that we can justify it in children. It's like, well, I don't think that's quite how it's supposed to be. I mean,
Well,
diabetes
in
should
the
be an old
80s,
age problem.
juvenile diabetes was type 1 diabetes,
Mm,
and maturity onset diabetes was what we call type 2
yeah.
diabetes. And you never ever saw type 2 diabetes in a child or even in a young person.
Yeah.
And now you do.
And
just
it's
to
becoming,
say,
yeah, sorry.
oh, sorry. I was just going to say about the protein, just going back
Yeah.
to cows and this idea of adding in insect protein and, a kind of animal protein. And just to say that what many people don't realize is that ruminant animals don't need any extra protein. They're not like pigs and poultry.
Yeah.
Pigs and poultry are monogastrics, and so we feed a lot of soya to pigs and poultry in this country. Soya that mainly comes from Latin America and the Amazon. Um, and but and in terms, we hardly feed any soya to ruminant animals. Only about 4% of the soya that we import into this country is fed to ruminants, and that will mostly be to high yielding, intensively reared dairy cows, not very little to beef and sheep. But because of this unique digestive system that a ruminant has, it can get all the protein it needs from the rumen bugs as they die off and pass through its digestive tract, and they produce the protein that it needs. And it's only when we really push these animals and make them very intensive that they need extra what in the old days I would have termed higher quality protein from soya or in the old days perhaps from fish meal. That doesn't happen anymore. But yeah, so it's unnecessary. And I was just on the soya thing. Again, people tend to think that we're buying in all this soya from the Amazon and cutting down the Amazon to rear. They usually blame it on beef. Well,
Yeah.
we hardly use any in beef production.
Yeah.
And actually, the biggest proportion of soya that we import into this country actually goes into making, artificial dairy and meat products for vegans and vegetarians, like tofu, that kind of thing. 45% of it is going into that market,
Yeah.
not into animal feed, and 35% goes into pigs and poultry because they, on the grain-based diets that we feed to intensive pigs and poultry, they have to have that extra protein. So, and that's one of the reasons why we don't advocate eating intensively reared meat from pigs and poultry and intensively reared dairying or intensively reared beef, which is a very, very small proportion of beef worldwide.
Yeah, and of course, soya is obviously got quite high in phytoestrogens, which is why sort of women who are sort of going through the menopause will sometimes sort of start having sort of soy as to try and sort of counteract that sort of effect. But you just wonder then, what is the effect on the meat? Of having phytoestrogens going into the body? Does that somehow get passed on through the meat as well for pigs and poultry? And I sometimes come across people who've had an itchy dog, and there's obviously they've fed chicken quite a lot in the past, and yet if they go onto the raw chicken, they still sometimes don't fully get over it, and they sort of put that down to the fact that a lot of the chicken meat obviously is reared on grains, and because the kibble was grain based and caused allergies, then eating the meat that was fed on the chicken, it carries on that. It's probably got more inflammatory than if it was the chickens were raised eating more naturally. And so, it just shows, doesn't it, how that what we feed our animals is important to our nutrition, as and that again that carries on for our cats and dogs as well. That and again, as Nita was saying earlier, it's the importance of how we heal that gut. And I liken it sometimes. I'm talking to people, oh, can we give a little bit of veg? It's like, well, no. If you've got someone who's got a peanut allergy, you can't just give them a little bit of peanut. It's some people, when they're that have that much of an anaphylactic reaction, it could be life-threatening to have just a little bit of peanut. And although, hopefully we haven't got any cats and dogs that are allergic on to that degree, but that the principle of having a little bit of what can cause it can actually be quite significant in terms of the effect that they have in the body. And this is
Yeah,
where
I know a local farmer, sorry to interrupt, who recently, in the last few years, developed such a severe allergy to soya protein that if he eats pork, and the pigs have been fed soya, he develops a reaction to it.
Okay, interesting. Well, that sort of confirms what I was wondering, and what we're sort of talking about here, and how it's important to get the diet for them right. And I suppose over the last couple of years, when I've been sort of looking into diet a lot more, I've also sort of looked at sort of quantum biology a lot more as well, and sort of come across Dr. Jack Kruse, that I'm sure you're aware of, and the input and Laszlo, about the deuterium and deuteromics and all the rest of it, and how the fat from animal fat is very low in deuterium compared to vegetable oils, which is much higher in deuterium, because that's where the plants store their deuterium when they're storing it. And so ultimately, I think nutrition probably comes down to deuterium burden. So it's interesting, isn't it, how all these, you sort of come across new bits of information that just isn't mainstream at all, got a huge amount of science behind it, and yet I get accused of having no science behind what I do. And you're going, well, I think I've got a lot more actually. I've just opened my mind and gone deeper into bits that maybe regard as a bit left field, but it's actually getting down to the nuts and bolts and nitty gritty of what food and nutrition is all about, not just for our animals, but also for us as well.
Well, there's lots of evidence out there of why we shouldn't be consuming vegetable oils. It's really clear.
Yeah.
It's, as we would say, it's time for an oil change. And in the book, the chapter is called Just Stop Vegetable Oil.
Yeah.
Vegetable oil is an ultra-processed food. It's not, we've only started eating it in the last 100 years. We didn't evolve with it. It's a very unnatural food. Vegetable oils don't even come from vegetables. And yeah, there's so many reasons why we shouldn't be eating them. It's the wrong type of fat, the wrong ratios of fat. It's one of the most harmful foods in our diet.
Yeah. Do you want to just expand a little bit more on, obviously, on offal and how nutrient dense it is, and how that on its own is more than sufficient to provide antioxidants and vitamins and minerals and all the rest of it? Because that's probably the one thing that all the people I get criticized on Facebook groups when I try and say, people will cut out the veg. Oh no, you can't do that, you're wrong. And you go, well, come on, they've got no
Well, offal
qualification at all.
is a much more nutrient dense food than plant foods are.
Yeah.
If you eat nose to tail, you'll get every single mineral and vitamin that the human body needs. People often think, well, where will I get my vitamin C from? But actually, offal even contains vitamin C. And then there are all the other issues, such as if you're eating a low carbohydrate diet, your requirement for many nutrients, including vitamin C, is lower than if you're eating a conventional Western diet. And if you look at, if in the book we compare liver with broccoli and blueberries, and the amount of various nutrients in them, and just about on everything, offal is the winner. Besides the amount, there are some nutrients that aren't in plant foods at all. Vitamin A, vitamin D, and vitamin B12. People think of, oh, well, carrots are a good source of vitamin A. Actually, no. Carrots have zero vitamin A. What they have is beta carotene, which our bodies then convert to vitamin A, or retinol as it's known. And that conversion depends on so many things, including how the food is cooked. And also, many people have an inefficient a gene which renders that conversion less efficient. So yeah, offal, eating nose to tail is what we should all be doing.
Yeah,
And yet our food guidelines, well, if you go shopping for carrots in the supermarket and you get the ones that come in a plastic bag rather than the ones that are loose, they're endorsed by Eat Well. Most of the packets I've seen in supermarkets, there's the Eat Well flower with a smiley face or whatever, and then there's writing next door, and it says, doesn't always say, but it often says rich in vitamin A.
Yeah.
So this is the people who are writing and pushing the national food guidelines, who think that there's vitamin A in carrots. And as Anita just said, there's none. It's beta carotene.
No.
And that's not easily absorbed, especially on a low-fat diet. It's more easily absorbed if we eat it with fat. It's not easily absorbed in the absence of fat. And Eat Well is a low-fat diet.
Yeah.
So even the people who write these nutrition guidelines are clueless, or if they're not clueless, they're simply hiding and not telling the truth.
It's actually incorrect to say carrots have vitamin A, and yet it's there on the back of a packet.
It's difficult, isn't it? Because obviously the nutrition courses now have become self-supporting in what's wrong, and that's my biggest concern about AI and things as well, is that it will search, you know, much more quickly, much more widely than I can do it. But if the predominance of the information out there is incorrect, it will reinforce what is incorrect. And that's a real problem, because obviously all the students and people coming through are now thinking, hey, I can write my essays and and all the rest of it. And of course, all they're doing is picking up all this preponderance of wrong information, and it's getting reinforced as being correct. I mean, I just out of example, I asked ChatGPT what is the best ratio of proteins, fats, and carbohydrates for dogs, and it said, well, and it started off saying, well, dogs are omnivores and therefore they need blah blah, and ended up with this high level of carbohydrate requirements. So then I said, well, no, dogs aren't omnivores, they're carnivores. Perhaps you can now reconstitute it. He goes, oh yes, you're right, and then gives me the correct proportion. So if you contradict it when you think it's wrong, and it will then come up with what you should be saying. And it is a problem, isn't it, with how the next generations who are being taught to research, when all the research itself is so incorrect, all you do is compound the problem. And I don't know quite how, other than obviously doing what we're doing, talking about it, is going to change that message, because there's an awful lot of people who are getting an awful lot of health problems as a result.
We're often asked, why is the messaging so bad? Why does the mainstream media get it so wrong? Why are the guidelines so wrong? And yeah, it is very depressing that the nutrition story for humans is back to front, but the story about farming is back to front. And now talking to you, it seems like
it's even worse on the veterinary side. It's all the people I was at uni with are lovely people, and they're doing everything with the best intention. But the pet food manufacturers have bought the universities in terms of the nutrition courses, and I've seen some of the contracts where they determine which lecturers are allowed to speak to the students, and which pet foods are allowed to be sold within the small animal practices associated with the universities, and they get a veto on anybody else coming in to speak on nutrition, and then they'll come in and do talks. And in my day, they put lots of beer behind the bar. I don't think they did that quite so much before. These days, it's not quite the same. But we get a free bar in the whole evening, basically, if we went along to these talks, and they spoke about their science diets and their prescription diets, which have got nothing prescribed in them at all, and they're not prescription because they're wrong. But then we'd learn that, get all the beer, and of course you're completely set up to be very positively angled towards the pet food companies. And then that's how Kraft started. He was friends with the guy who first developed kibbles. So it's like, it's just so
and
ingrained.
now we've got things like Bovea being marketed, to reduce methane from cows. It's crazy because methane from ruminants does not contribute to climate change, and actually grazing livestock are contributing to the drawdown of carbon from the atmosphere to store it in the soil beneath grassland. So the idea of trying to get this product into animals and making ruminant farming worldwide dependent on, I can see a time where you will only be able to rear ruminant livestock if you're feeding this kind of thing. So immediately you're going to have to intensify, because if you imagine, sheep farmers on the Welsh hills, they can't be feeding something like that because they're already very extensive. The animals are basically eating grass for most of the time, probably all the time. You're not going out and hand feeding them.
I mean, it's bonkers, isn't it? Because there is no carbon atom in a cow that hasn't come from plants, which hasn't come from CO2. So the idea that an organism that's got all its whole substance from the atmosphere can somehow make the atmosphere worse than it previously was is just an impossibility.
Nonsense, because like with us, the IPCC totally accepts that we shouldn't count the carbon dioxide that we and other animals breathe out, because it's part of the biogenic carbon cycle, because it came from the food that we ate. That carbon in the carbon dioxide came from the food that we ate, and ultimately the plants that we ate, or the animals that we ate, and that carbon dioxide, that carbon in the plants came from the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that the plant took out of the atmosphere during photosynthesis. It's with methane from cows, it should be treated in exactly the same way. The carbon came from the carbohydrate in the plants got it out of the atmosphere. So the methane that the cow belches out breaks down quite rapidly to carbon dioxide, and is just replacing the carbon dioxide that the plant took out of the atmosphere in the first place. And also you're actually getting a net benefit, because both the plants and the animals are putting some of that carbon into the soil. So the animal through its dung, that's why grassland soils are always higher in carbon, higher in organic matter than arable soils, which are doing exactly the opposite. It's those arable soils, the disturbance of the soil, the exposure of the soil to the air, that leads to emissions of carbon dioxide into the air.
Yeah, I mean, it is, isn't it? It's fascinating. And that was one side of the book that I think why everybody should read it, is to understand how all, if they want to move us on to plant-based nutrition, how that monoculture that would have to be there to do that, how damaging it is to the soil and to the carbon sequestration. Not that CO2 is a problem anyway, because it's convection that controls the heat of the planet, not radiation anyway, because if there's, obviously there is some radiation, the sun radiates down, it heats up the earth, and then it bounces back. But as it bounces back, it hits a molecule, but that molecule, it dissipates it in all directions. So 50% carries on out and 50% goes back, and then it bounces back. So over time, all the radiated heat actually does get back radiated out again, but it just gets slowed down because there's a bit bouncing it back in between, but it still ultimately eventually all goes, and it's, it delays the heating effect, or is caused by about a few minutes rather than anything else. And it's cloud cover at night is, that's what, if there's cloud cover, you stay warm at night, don't you? And if there's no cloud, it gets cold at night. But yeah, if it was air composition that was causing that, it would make no difference whatsoever. The air temperature wouldn't get colder at night just because there was cloud or not cloud. It would be purely because of the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So they can't have it always. It's just bonkers, isn't it?
Anyway, 1/3 of the extra carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in the last couple of hundred years has come from the soil, mostly from arable farming, released from the soil from arable farming.
Yeah, and then CO2 goes up and then it warms. Warming happens and then CO2 goes up because so much CO2 is stored in the sea, isn't it? And I say to people, it's like having a glass of champagne. It keeps producing bubbles because it's getting warmer in your hand as it's getting warmer. So the gas comes out. So obviously temperature has got to precede gas. It can be no other order. So again, another narrative that is being shoved down people's throats and justifying a political agenda that's got nothing whatsoever to do with science.
Talking about that political agenda, just in terms of like soil degradation and desertification and carbon emissions and so on. Sometimes there are situations where grazing livestock are damaging the soil and it's being desertified. I saw that in Mongolia when I was working there, and it's happening in other areas. But this is because of political interference that has changed the way that nomadic herders, pastoralists, are able to move their animals, and has forced them to give up their traditional methods of moving around and grazing, and so they're no longer able to do the kind of grazing that Alan Savory advocates, where you move on and you don't come back for a long time. You allow the grassland to regenerate. So it's political interference usually.
I can imagine, and I'm sure it all goes all ways as usual, isn't it? It's a network of misinformation and poor decisions. But we've come to sort of the end of our hour, and it's been absolutely brilliant talking to you all. And hopefully, I think we've given everybody who watches a bit of a smattering about what the book, and they sort of whetted their interest, and will go out and get it, because it is a very good read, and it's not heavy reading either. There are some really amusing bits dotted in it as well. So it's not a difficult read, and I think everybody, we're getting to the situation with our own health. We've seen it in the NHS where people can't get an appointment for love nor money. So the answer to that isn't to blame the NHS. The answer is to actually take responsibility for your own health, and that means starting with nutrition. And I'd say the book is foundational. And maybe just before we should go, we'll explain the title of the book, because it certainly grabbed my attention, and I think so if someone wants to just give a quick a quick explanation of why the book is titled why it is, and then we'll do a quick wrap up and any other final comments, and then it's been great. Thank you all very much for giving up your time to do this.
Okay, so to explain the title very briefly, the best evidence for the part of the title which says why vegans have smaller brains comes from looking at babies who've been breastfed by vegan mothers. Some of these babies develop severe brain atrophy. And if the babies are treated with vitamin B12, within a certain time frame, that the brain atrophy reverses completely. Brain atrophy is a shrinking of the brain. We all get some shrinking of our brain as we get older. It starts in our 20s, about 1% a year. It speeds up to 2% a year from our 50s onwards. And what matters is the rate at which our brains shrink. And studies on the elderly have found that if you have a diet that is if you have low B12 levels, vitamin B12, the rate at which your brain shrinks speeds up. And that's more likely to lead to dementia. It's the rate that matters. And there are some excellent studies in elderly people showing this. There's one from the University of Oxford. There's the Rotterdam scan study. There's one from the Karolinska Institute. What's important here is that vitamin B12 isn't found in any plant food. There are other nutrients that matter too, such as an omega-3 fat called DHA, and all this evidence points to the fact that your brain shrinks more if you have a plant food diet. The evidence from babies and from elderly people.
There we go. There we go. That's the explanation in the book. That's to encourage people to listen to all the way to the end. Well, has anybody got any other final comments? Because I think hopefully people have found it very enlightening and it was sort of fairly broad ranging. So Dave, I can see you.
It's been fascinating, as I said, to kind of to see another angle, your angle on animals and veterinary, how much it chimes with what we're saying in the book.
Yeah.
Really interesting.
No, it's brilliant. It's brilliant just to have that backup to, people wondering about feeding plants, and say it's important what you don't feed is as important as what you do feed. And that's sort of the big take home, I think, from my angle as well. Marvelous. Well, if we finish there, I shall cease the recording and
Thank you.